So getting onto moral condemnation and sort
Mm,
of the back and forth on the left. Recently, obviously, you've spoken about this a lot on your podcast, Give Them an Argument. The Force the Vote, it's really torn apart the left, at least the online left, it seems like,
yeah.
in a way that even past sort of squabbles really never didn't seem to make as big of a ripple. So could you just give us a quick
Sure.
rundown of your take on Force the Vote? And are you surprised or disheartened by some of the allies in the movement who've maybe, sort of gone all in for this sort of hype train
Mm.
for clicks and interactions? And is that even a fair read to begin with?
It's a fair read of some people, certainly not everybody. There are people who support Force the Vote who I consider to be friends and comrades. Katie Halper,
Right.
is a very prominent, Force the Vote person, and
Right. She's
somebody
awesome.
somebody I have a good working relationship with. I like Katie. Cornel West supported Force the Vote, and I'm an atheist, but he's about as close as I get to having a saint.
Yeah.
I think so I certainly don't fault anybody particularly for having a different take on the underlying issue. So just real quick, I think so. The idea of Force the Vote was that AOC and the others, and actually often it was a little unclear who we were talking about, which I think was
Yeah.
part of the problem. That
Right.
do we mean the large and politically diverse progressive caucus, of which AOC and the Squad are the furthest left tip, but it's a ton of people, and they don't particularly agree with each other. It's the stuff they're going to agree on is pretty minimalistic. Are we talking about what they should have done? Are we talking about what the Squad should have done? Are we talking about what AOC as an individual should have done, which sometimes it seemed like it. But in any case, some combination of these people, the idea was that they should have threatened to withhold their votes from Nancy Pelosi in the leadership election for Speaker of the House of Representatives, in exchange, and use that leverage to demand having a floor vote on Medicare for all, which everybody, sometimes Jimmy Dore would seem to forget this, but almost everybody seemed to agree, would not actually have led to us having Medicare for all. But it would be something that some people thought like it would be like a symbolic victory just to have the vote, or that having everybody on record because there had been a vote would have been useful in primaries in 2 years, or they, maybe just like the hoopla around the vote would have been a good opportunity to have like viral moments about Medicare for all. These are all the kinds of arguments that people used for it. So I thought two things about this, and I want to be clear about how they're two different things, right? So one, the first thing is I was never sold on the tactic. It never really made that much sense to me. That I thought that if it happened, and you know, I'm I would not at all be against, by the way, just having AOC and the others just vote against Nancy Pelosi just on general principle, just to be like, it's a small gesture, but it might be somewhat ideologically clarifying for casual, news viewers, that like, oh, these people are not on the same team. I think there'd be some value to that. I suspect that she'd be elected anyway because, knowing Nancy Pelosi, if she lost 5 or 10 or 15 Democratic votes, she would probably make some unspeakably evil vote with deal with 5 or 10 or 15 Republicans. I'm pretty sure that's how it would play out. But whatever, it might be worth it anyway. But the idea of having this, like, of forcing this symbolic vote on Medicare for all, even on the assumption they could have forced it, never really made sense to me because I think that it was based on a bad analysis of what the problem is right now. Like, that um, why is it that people keep voting for Democrats in primaries who are against Medicare for all? Well, one thing we can agree on is that it's not because most people are against Medicare for all, because in polls, and it depends a little bit on how you phrase the question, but I think there's a lot of polling evidence that most people support it, and certainly most Democrats support it. So that's not it. So why is it? Well, I think the Force the Vote people, a lot of them thought that the reason was that most people, like maybe like most Democratic voters who support Medicare for all, just don't understand that centrists are against it. But I never really thought that was right. I'm sure there's some of that, but I don't think that's the main problem. I think the main problem is not that they're not aware that they're against it. I mean, Joe Biden won the Democratic primary, and he was the only, really the only major candidate, the only candidate except for these like really like obscure deep cut people like, you know, Delaney and Hickenlooper, who wasn't even like, he wasn't even pretending. He wasn't even doing any triangulating bullshit about Medicare for all who want it or anything like that. You know, he was just, yeah, I'm against it. I'd veto it. And he still won. Why is that? Well, my take on why that is not that people by and large didn't know, but that it wasn't a big priority for them. And why wasn't it a big priority for them, right? Why is it that the only thing they were voting based on is who they thought would be a better candidate to beat Trump, rather than being like, oh, wait a second, but I really want healthcare, and you know, maybe if Bernie could win, or maybe even if he'd be a slightly weaker candidate. I obviously don't think this. I'm saying a lot of people did, right? You know, but even if he'd be a slightly weaker candidate, you know, maybe I'll vote for him anyway because I really want to get that healthcare. Why is it that they didn't do that? Why is it that we can have giant protests and riots about police brutality, but we're not going to have giant protests and riots about Medicare for all? It's not that most people don't like the idea. It's not that they're not aware that the establishment, you know, is largely opposed to it. I think it's actually just the opposite. It's that they're so aware that the establishment is opposed to it that they just don't take it seriously as a real world possibility. That it just sounds like a nice pipe dream, like something they would support if they'd love to have it happen, right? A pollster calls them up and says, hey, how would you like it if the government gave you health care? I think most normal people are going to say, yeah, I love it. That sounds good. Let's do that, right? But they don't think it's going to happen. It doesn't really fit with their experience of reality, that they think, yeah, that would be wonderful, but whatever, it's never going to happen. And so my concern is that having a 3-1 defeat in a Democratic controlled House
Right.
would only deepen that impression that it's never going to happen and it's silly to even focus on it. I actually think it would make it harder to primary people, because I can just imagine that, like in
Yes.
2022, some centrist, you know, Democratic congressman being like, you know, I think it would hand him a talking point. It'd be like, hey, I don't know why my opponent keeps talking about this Medicare for all thing that is clearly never, ever going to happen. Look at how badly it was defeated in a Democratic controlled House. Instead, you know, I'm moving on to talk about realistic, incremental, insert some centrist bullshit here, healthcare reforms that might actually happen. And I don't want to give them that gift. So that'd be my critique of the tactic itself. But
Okay.
if the only issue was, okay, is you know, and we could do a much deeper dive version on all the arguments that were used for it and why I'm not persuaded by them, but I think that's
Right.
probably good for this, right? Uh so that's my critique of the tactic itself. But then the other question is, okay, look, if I disagree with people about whether this one particular kind of wonky inside baseball like idea for like a parliamentary maneuver, you know,
Right.
to have a symbolic vote makes sense, I'm totally happy to just have that be a friendly and extremely minor tactical disagreement among close allies. That doesn't really bother me. What bothers me about a lot of the energy around force the vote is that instead of doing what it was supposed to do, right? And I know a lot of people are going to hear this as tone policing, but that's really not the point, right? That like instead of doing what it was supposed to do, which is to drive a wedge between people who support Medicare for all and people who oppose Medicare for all, which could be useful. Instead of doing that, it's the effect of it is to drive a wedge between, you know, people who are consume left media or are active in online leftist spaces, and the the most hardcore Medicare for all supporters in Congress, and anybody who doesn't go along with demonizing the most hardcore Medicare for all supporters in Congress. So like when Jimmy Dore says AOC is standing between you and healthcare, why that makes me crazy is not just or even primarily that it's unfair to AOC, although it certainly is. You know, I mean, I've got my criticisms, but I mean, that's crazy. But the thing that primarily bothers me about it is that I think like tactically, it's just counterproductive to the point of insanity. What's standing between you and healthcare is that we don't have about 200 more AOCs in Congress. And so telling people, sending this message that the few we've managed to elect so far are sellouts and, not grifters and not really worth supporting, I think is a huge gift to Nancy Pelosi in practice.